Hello and welcome to Identity Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue. And this week we're discussing zero standing privilege with Ian Glazer and Vlad Shapiro. Welcome, Ian.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And welcome, Vlad.
Thank you and welcome everybody.
So I'll just start off with you, Ian. What is zero standing privilege and how does it differ from least privilege?
So, zero standing privilege is the idea that you have an account in the most basic of senses, right? So you think about typically let's for the moment constrain this to an enterprise workforce kind of conversation. You've got an account in, say, the CRM system, and that account has a bunch of privileges associated with it. Whether you're using that account or not, that account has privilege associated with it. And that's okay. And so, like, the world of least privilege, the world of saying, if we want to apply the principle of least privilege, it says that account should have as minimal rights as possible, but yet still be functional for the user. Okay, pretty straightforward. Here's the thing. At 2 a.m. on, Saturday night, Sunday morning, that account still has some amount of privilege. And if someone or something was to get access to those credentials, then they can do whatever that account can do. Zero standing privilege says, tell you what, you have an account and only name, basically, at that, continuing the analogy, the CRM system. So you have, a user ID, but it has literally nothing associated with it, nothing whatsoever. And at the time you create a session or you get issued a token on your behalf for that account, that's when you evaluate policy and environmental condition and say, oh, okay, for this session, at this very moment, this is the rights that account's going to have. So when the session goes away, when the token goes away, there's no more privilege that could be abused because there's nothing there to begin with.
Can I show the graphs?
You can show the graphs. Go for it.
So this is the first graph from the article you wrote for Signal. And this is, I guess, the least privilege model. So what does this show exactly?
Yeah, so think about the idea here was that we were going to take a new employee from onboard, day 0, through 30 days into their future in the enterprise. And that the amount of access that they had over those 30 days waxes and wanes. Sometimes, you're going to have more. Maybe there was hypothetically a review process and you had some taken away. But in all of the seconds that add up those 30 days, like, you can sort of notionally aggregate how much access the individual had available at any point in time. And so What that graph showed was simply saying, like, you accrete and you lose access as the days go by, as the minutes go by. And whether you're using it or not, it's still assigned to a user account somewhere, and it still could be exploited.
And so then this is this is the new graph that you're proposing.
So the idea is here, same basic idea, except think about only doling out that access at time of use. When I create a new session with this web application, when I get a token issued to my app. And so then if you will, the window of exposure, or the moments that I have that access in that specific session or specific token associated with that specific token, is a far smaller time than if we just had standing privilege of any form.
So a lot of the times I basically don't have the right to do anything.
That's right. That's right. So the idea notionally is this continues to limit the window of exposure that an organization may have. And I don't think that this is something that you would apply today across the board. Every kind of account, every kind of user. Like, I don't think so. I think the place to start is to think about what's the most privileged functions and the most privileged operations, like people working on production access systems, right? You've got to make a live ACL change in a network configuration. It's, a highly privileged thing. The chances of doing it, of having negative impact if you do it wrong are pretty high. And you really don't want the rights to do that just hanging around dormant for someone to harvest.
So I invited Vlad to be co-host today because I think that he's a good reality check on this is maybe a good metaphor, but is this metaphor really going to work? Vlad,
Yeah.
do you have any questions or thoughts on this?
Well, I have, first of all, Ian, thank you very much for such a great definition. I love it. I love the word that it's standing, right? Not lying down, but standing. That's good. But another thing is I would like to add is I think one of the angles I'm usually taking on is angles related to human factor and business. So here is in the recent presentations, and yes, will be one at the Identiverse too, related to the operations actually. I was talking about a concept of what some people dubbed as task-based, access controls. So basically, in reality, we have a bunch of tasks we need to perform. Some of those tasks are burst given. Like, for example, I'm at my job, I'm a pig administrator, so I must update, I must upgrade, and I must do a lot of stuff with it. But as Ian said, how often am I doing this? Like upgrade comes only when new version comes in, right? So in the middle of that, I don't use it. So I agree with that. But the second thing is what usually happens in addition to very privileged technology stuff, which we can actually start talking to business with, right? Is the business tasks, right? You are assigned something, right? And when you are assigned a task, which I call business need, now you must have certain privileges to be able to perform it. So the next question is, who will define what kind of privileges you need, right? In my opinion, and this is a turnaround to the business, to say, whoever assign you stuff should have a list of prerequisites already created in the best case scenario, based either on experience or on the kind of a research done before. So if your task is actually assigned to you, guess what happened? You don't need to request it anymore. You should get it automatically as a sign of a token, which is I love the most because you already have provision, right? But you have absolutely nothing in it. Now this token comes in, tokens connect directly to whatever your deadline is. As soon as your task is closed, it automatically means deprovisioning. Your token is gone, right?
Yeah.
And you can, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about that. We're going to address first a quick comment in our question in the comments
Sure.
about history, right? So the idea around ZSP is that the reason why you've got some shell of an account, let's say, is if only because I need audit durability over time, right? I need to make sure that my username, my associated internal identifier is consistent, and that I'm consistently auditing the actions of users. That never changes. It's just a function of whether there's association to privilege with that account over time. That's the thing we're really focused on. But, Vlad, to your point that you were making, two things I think about here. One is, whether it's the business or it's IT that is aggregating privileges assigned to either responsibilities or business tasks or exceptional conditions, there is still, and you're right to say this, there's still some data gathering and policy definition. I think the change here is, instead of a policy definition that triggers a user provisioning event, so an admin time control, or defines, hey, this is in the realm of things you are allowed to request. So if you're doing access request-based management, this simply says, here's a set of conditions that need to be met. We'll evaluate them when the user is going to perform this task. Let's say when we're actually creating a session. And here's the associated entitlements tied to it. And if your business conditions aren't met, for example, then you're not going to get that privilege. And a really good example of this one, I think, is, I'll go back to the production access. So you're going to go and you're going to make some change to, let's say, a database that we've got up in production. There's a very specific bug. We've got to go apply something. Let's go do that. Most big organizations, you don't touch production unless you've got an open ticket, right? Because we need an audit trail that says, hey, we had a finding, there's a bug, that's going to trigger essentially an event where I need to go repair something. Let's open a ticket to mark that. It's assigned to Vlad. Vlad is picking that ticket up, gonna go do the work. And when he's done, it's done. We close the ticket, we close the audit process. So considering things like that business context to say, hey, does Vlad have a valid ticket to go work on the production database? If the answer is no, then he simply doesn't get that right. And I think the nice thing is it allows you to describe policy without triggering the risk of added standing privilege, right? You don't need that production access 24/7. And your business process says, well, no, of course Vlad shouldn't have access that often. I mean, have you met him? No, absolutely not. And so it allows kind of the best of both worlds, mitigation of risk and yet still documentation of policy.
Absolutely agree. The thing is, what we have to consider as practitioners, right, is the fact that the business is driving. If we show business clear ROI or clear savings somewhere and understanding without losing the security, the tracing, the audit, this is great. So I absolutely agree with it. I'm just saying that what we need to do is, in my opinion, what a very important part of it is to explain business. They need to spend some time to define this, because the definition of what are the conditions are critically important. And in my opinion, we can involve even people like COO about this, right? Not only CEO, because it's about operations, right? Mm-hmm. And especially it's going to work really well when the operation is repetitive. Mm-hmm. Like you have, like in, I work in a financial institution. So in a financial institution, you always perform similar actions towards your customers or partners or whatever, but different people do that. So if we define it once, we can really replicate it to others, and we can connect it to some kind of user behavior analysis and something which will give us also risk. And that one, in my opinion, gives a great combination, which we can, I don't want to say that word, but sell it to the member, to the C-level, to why we're doing it and why we need business to actually take part of it, and might be part of the budget too, because it's not only technology. What do you think?
The great thing about that, Vlad, is 98% of everything you just talked about are things that we as practitioners need to do today. If I'm doing very classic user provisioning, classic rules, those kinds of things, then knowing what are the business roles, what are the technical roles, what job functions do they map to, what job titles do they map to, that's all part of what we do today notionally. And I think there are certainly still struggles to do it for a variety of reasons. But what changes in the kinds of things I'm talking about is not that, but really the very last part, where in a classic admin time type world, a classic identity governance administration world, it would trigger a provisioning event. Or if I'm doing more what we would call sort of in an old school way, access management, where, you know what, maybe at the point of I'm SSOing into the app, I'm going to just in time add just a sprinkle of extra access because I have a policy over that. Imagine that we actually can think about these things now. Yeah, login's interesting, but it's not my life, right? Like there's a whole lot of interesting story that comes after login. So what events would trigger change in my access, my rights in a more dynamic way, both positively and negatively? Like we may add things because, oh, look, yep, that ticket just opened. Ian's got a session. Good. We'll bless it. We'll add access to it. Or it may be, hey, look, business conditions have changed. He, for whatever reason, turned off his ZTA client on his desktop. Okay, we'll tell you what, that's a pretty strong signal something not so bueno's happening. Let's stop access, right? Or let's trim a couple of very specific things away. The dynamicism of this tied back to the very rooted practice that we do today of like, how do we map individuals to their job functions, the tasks they need to perform, and the privileges, that all stays the same. So I think that's quite powerful.
I agree. One little question related to what I'm going to be talking about. If something goes wrong, if for some reason, certain conditions, do we have an ability to include a kind of a, workaround, or you're going to call it, something as a part of our construction of zero standing policies? So something which allows us to, override in case we need it.
So let's separate out the concept of it, which says, okay, there's no, we're really only looking at time of use in a dynamic way to assign privilege. The how mechanism is what you're asking about here, which says like, well, look, I could architect this. I can think of 3 different ways to do it. And regardless, I need a break glass. I need a situation for a variety of reasons, none the least of which is, and you have to do this today, our means of execution of enacting this policy is not working for some reason. The provisioning system is down. The SSO system is down. The authorization system is down, right? Like, there's going to be component failure. There's also going to be oh, whoops, we wrote a new policy and we didn't test it in Sandbox, and we just pushed it, and we have over or under, granted access. In a provisioning world, that means like, oh crap, I just provisioned way more many people than I expected to. Like, I've done that myself to we granted too much privilege, right? Those problems are still the same. The planning mechanism still needs to be the same. I think one of the things that is parallel to this is what happens with event signaling, things like what's going on with the shared signals framework and with CAPE, that may allow us a more dynamic kind of safety net, let's say, right? We're used to things not going right, but the fixes are often incredibly manual, including the detection. And I think there's a lot of things, not just around zero standing privilege, that's going on in identity right now, which is super exciting, that says we may be moving into an era of far more dynamic capability, far more interesting events, and the ability to react to those things. And that's super exciting to me because it breaks us out of the binary world of either something happens before you use it or the moment you log in, and there's nothing else to think about, which is just flagrantly wrong.
If I could jump in for 1 second. So Ian, even if we say what you're saying is true, we're just going to grant what you're saying as the assumption, and we're moving from some type of person-based granularity to more of a task-based granularity. What do you think are the minimum features that a software vendor would need in order to implement something of value to enterprises to make this like new strategy real?
So I think the task-based or person-based is actually not related to the second part of the question. Like, you may choose to create policy nuggets, for lack of a better word, that are more oriented around job function, job task. You may orient them around individuals, job title, what have you, or both. I think that's fine. And that's not necessarily new. I think driving more business value out of them is something we need to work on. But let's talk about the minimum features, right? And I would start with, where do we actually want to apply this, right? Because as I said in the onset, I don't think we're going to want to do this everywhere all the time, especially in this moment, right? We're just not ready for it. Our systems aren't ready for it. The places to think about it are, well, first, where are you already consistently applying the policy of least privilege? Can you look yourself in the mirror and say, hey, you know what? Every month, this critical system, we go through and we review the access, both the definitions, the roles or the groups, as well as the assignments. I mean, Vlad, keep me honest here, but I don't know a lot of practitioners who do that on the regular basis, if only because they've got their hair on fire with 7 other things they got to worry about. And that's just the reality of things. So I would say, start with the things that, if they were to be abused, would have the highest blast radius. And for every business, that may be different. It may be, hey, look, anyone who can touch DNS in our complex infrastructure, let's say we're a SaaS provider, like, that has the maximal blast radius. So I want to start with any system that touches how you make changes to DNS. For another company, it may be, look, our financial systems are our lifeblood, maybe SOX related, maybe other. And I want to look at 2 or 3 critical ones within that have if we're abused, the maximum blast radius. And then start to say, do those systems have, in today's world, a capability for, within a session, dialing up or down access? Some do, some may not. Some may be easy to add, some may not. Then start to say, okay, do we have those knobs, those controls? Could we do it at login time? Can we do it after login time? And sort of do that evaluative framework, and then start to say, for this system over here, we've got great just-in-time at-session creation controls to dial up and down access, which means we actually could strip the standing access out of these users down to a really small amount. It may not be zero, but it approaches it. And we can actually affect policy in a just-in-time, sort of at the moment of SSO fashion. That's a great step towards mitigating risk. Is it sort of pure ZSP? I don't really care, because you're actually achieving a real outcome, which is minimizing the blast radius.
So you've done a good job of saying like where to start, or we're going to start with the applications. But what does that actually look like? So okay, we update the application code. What does that look like? And what type of new infrastructure does that require in order to facilitate a zero standing privilege architecture?
So I don't necessarily think it requires anything new. I think that for some systems where you've got those kinds of controls, you can actually achieve it with a combination of an IGA system and your SSO tool. Reason being, you can still define a policy that says, for this kind of use, this is what's allowed, right? These are the same kinds of policies you would have written for an access request type policy. Ian's allowed to ask for this kind of thing. Okay, defines the sort of domain in which this can happen. Then you have to make that policy available to your SSO system, right? So when I go and access that system, it says, oh, hey, look, I need to include these two other, let's say, groups or roles in the SAML assertion that says, hey, system, add this to what his user. And that can dynamically happen. Now, give you an example of that. Previous to my work at Weave, I was looking after identity products and services at Salesforce. And so when you log into Salesforce, you actually have an opportunity programmatically to say, pull something out of an assertion, pull something out of an ID token and say, oh, okay, based on this, I'm going to dial up or down the access rights of an individual. That's not adding any new necessarily technology to the mix. It's using what you got. Now, are there situations where you could add a policy evaluation engine that can do this more dynamically, that can be invoked in the application code, let's say, if you wanted to? Sure, of course you could. Is it required? No, I don't think so. I think we can make meaningful steps without adding new bits to the mix. There's reasons to do that for other reasons, but I don't think it's strictly speaking you have to do.
Vlad, do you think we have the tools that we need?
I think, well, I would say this way. We do have tools which could be configured to do this. I strongly believe that one of the things which we'll go for, and there's going to be a lot of conversation about that at the Dataverse, by the way, is authorization and how we can standardize the way the authorization is translated all over the place. So practically, here's a reality what I'm dealing with, right? I have, ping system, which has, like Ian said, ability to pull through the SAML assertion certain things. If I'm a member of a group, I can go in and so on and so forth. But every application has its own user store. Every application has its own layer. And I have no idea what's going to happen if the person goes in. Now, if that's right. So now, if we're trying to use the zero standing privilege and those applications somehow would support some kind of a standardization and authorization field, I don't know, it's going to be Aura or it's going to be anything else, right? So then we can attach this information to the process, because when someone is from my company is trying to connect to some SAS application, right, we can add a lot of information about that person with that as a part of the policy building. But the other side should be able to accept it. So more standardization of acceptance of authorization policy goes across the board, we can better control of what's going on. And I think this is what we're missing. And Ian, your opinion is we're going to go there? Is that going to be similar to, or?
I don't know if I agree with that position. Here's why. It has taken a decade, give or take, to get to a place where we can represent user provisioning events in a neutral representation in a widespread way, right? So SCIM has given us the ability to sort of say, here's a taxonomy, here is notionally a base schema for these kinds of events, and it can be extended. And we've seen, I would say, reasonable adoption. Obviously, this is not the first time we've taken a run at this problem, but this is the first time we've actually had success. That problem of just representing the provisioning events in a sort of a neutral representation has taken more than 2 decades of actual work if we go back to the way it started. I don't believe that I don't think we're going to make a ton of progress having third-party systems, generic, any kind of system accepting a generic authorization decision, if only because the way applications and services work within themselves, right? Their own representation of privilege and how those relate and what that means is so diverse. What I think is going to happen always, whether you're doing it at the provisioning time or you're doing it, heck, when you're presenting a token with, rich authorization information in it from, let's say, an OAuth perspective, is that there's always a translation going to happen. I don't think you're ever going to get native support for any. Look, Zackermal's been around for longer than we've been alive.
Yeah.
That's not a true statement, by the way, but let's pretend. So Zackermal's been around for a heck of a long time, and no application that I know of has a native sort of Zackermal interface to it, unless someone specifically put it there and they really liked angle brackets. So I'm not so much concerned about I don't believe necessarily we need a neutral representation of an authorization policy. What we do need to do is have a way that makes it very simple to extract what the authorization model is out of a target system. Arguably, SCIM can help here. I don't think it fits the bill completely, but it helps. And a way to translate whatever you're using as your policy language and your policy governance model into that language in the way that makes sense for the system. It could be a SCIM message. It could be something in SAML. It could be simply a scope inside of an OAuth token. There's a pretty broad range there, and I don't want to sort of have to force us into standardizing that. I think it's the wrong place.
Well, it's a great point. Sorry, it's just a great point. So basically what I'm trying to kind of, I think it's kind of a reverse. It's kind of synchronization, but in a very interesting way. So you're taking what's inside of application, right? And try to simplify it in the language which can be accepted by the central, I would say, authorization engine. Is that something?
Actually, and I'll build on that a little bit. So getting the data to the policy engine or to whatever is making this decision is going to be really critical. And it leads me to wonder if we need what you mentioned was the old SSO systems might be okay. But what I think we're seeing is that actually this identity and security infrastructure is moving to a more asynchronous nature from a synchronous nature. And the need for data, like Vlad is alluding to, is part of that because we constantly need this updated data in order to make these new security decisions. Do you see that shift happening from synchronous to asynchronous?
I hope I'm seeing it. Like, that's definitely an outcome I'd like to see. But Mike, to your point, the thing that is really exciting, and I feel like it's been in the last year, maybe a little bit less, is the conversation about identity data and managing it with, let's say, an up-level set of skills and capabilities is really exciting to me. There's been a lot of talk about identity fabric, and certainly the analysts are, it's their new shiny thing, and they're talking about a more dynamic relationship of different kinds of identity services. They're just beginning to, in my opinion, actually start talking about what's the grist for the mill, which is the relevant data from target systems, from environmental systems, in a place that can be used by the entire fabric. And that's like a hugely exciting thing. And in today's world, a very difficult thing to do on your own, unless you're willing to throw a lot of bodies and resources at it.
And, there's recently been a bit of innovation in the OAuth area, especially around this idea of transaction tokens. And it seems like transactions tokens maybe fit this model well because there's sort of this continual process of passing the token along, but the service is basically then trading that token for a new token. Do you see any, do you think that something like zero standing privilege could be implemented more easily with this new type of architecture?
I'm not sure, to be perfectly honest with you, because I think the degree that you take the ideas of zero standing privilege and put them into practice could be at so many different levels inside of an infrastructure, right? And so it could be hey, we're going to do our IGA system and our SSO system, and it's going to be mostly focused on our web apps that are SOX material, right? I could say that. And in that world, like, I don't need to drive all the way to where my head goes when I think about transaction tokens. To me, this is much more about propagating very specific identity information into a microservice architecture for workload identity related issues, and then ensuring I've got traceability. And that's a far more complicated thing that has a different kind of need. Could it be done? Yeah, I think there's a part to play there. I don't necessarily see a strong tie between the two of them. Maybe I'm missing something on this one.
Vlad, any thoughts on
Well, transaction.
new? Yeah, so I'm wondering if there are new tools that we need to address this new sort of paradigm that we're trying to align to. And I'll ask it a different way, or maybe a related question. Is this a workforce problem, or does this apply to consumers and citizen authorization too?
This is
I
so my take, sorry, Vlad, to cut you off. My take is this is an everything problem, right? You have user accounts, they have associated privileges. Those privileges can be abused whether you're using that account or you're not using that account. And so that's the sort of thing I want to strike at on this. It doesn't matter whether it's workforce or individual. In fact, arguably, doing this in a consumer setting would be even more powerful, right? Because, for example, the ability to change your ship to address in your user account theoretically could be abused. If you weren't using the account, why should you have anything associated with it? Like, I think the when I talk about blast radius of like how something could be abused, some of that may be very local and personal in a consumer or citizen identity use case. And the other side of it on a workforce is about, protecting the organization. So I think there's applicability in all of these use cases. It is a question, though, of where does it make the most sense to start? I'm always suspicious of any identity story that says you have to do this everywhere or you get no value out of it. Like, you have to automate provision to every system for all things all the time. Well, we all know that's ridiculous, right, Vlad? You're already laughing at that.
Yes,
Like,
yeah.
I'm always suspicious of those kinds of things.
Well, in my opinion, I think we should start with the workforce, and the reason why is because in case of consumers, adoption really is not in our control, right? So it's like people going to use it or not going to use it. It's not up to us, right? I don't want to go into marketing and sales about that. But when it comes to workforce, at least we can put some policies around, and people kind of must use it. And it's going to be easier to measure the success results because we have much better control of environment and who is doing it, and we can also definitely watch what's happening. So that is where it's probably should be used. And in my opinion, we do not a lot of companies do not have enough maturity to even understand what we're talking about. All right, we have to dumb it down to the very, very simple level, avoiding all the technical words. And by the way, this is why zero standing privileges is great, because it sounds normal. It doesn't use any XAML or SAML or any of those words. So and that's where we're going to start from practical standpoint. We I always test my presentations on people who have no idea what identity is or identity management. If they understand what I'm saying, good, excellent. Then it means I'm doing my job. So that's I think where we're going to go with all of that. And to have support from the management, it's much easier when we practically put things like how to protect. I always for building guardrails. I always against the notion that users are the ones who are all the troubles. If we don't have enough guardrails, then it's our problem. And every time you say, okay, this helps us to have guardrails, and people there can do their job, but there are some guardrails to help them out, always finds positive answer and reply from the management.
The one thing, Vlad, I'll push back on is not so much the assertion about, where we may have more control and more visibility, but the how here. If I believe you can start with today's technologies, with things you have in your infrastructure, and make movement towards zero standing privilege in the systems you have today. The end users are going to be literally none the wiser. They're going to do their jobs.
Yeah.
They're going to do the things they need to do, whether they are third-party, remote workers who are coming in to do an emergency patch fix, or it's seasonal workers, or it's full-time in. It's not going to matter, right? This is really something that hides sort of in the back end of things. It's the world where the practitioners are thinking about this with their security peers and saying, where do we have the most exposure, either because of the nature of the system or the number of the users or the sort of cross product of the number of users, the nature of the system, and the privileges that they typically have. And knowing, Vlad, you're a math guy, and that's going to only get, you salivating, and looking at that and saying like, okay, look, the principle of least privilege is a great notional idea. In my own experience, I've seen people say, we're doing least privilege. And then you ask them like, are you? Like, how often do you actually review the entitlements to see if we can skinny down what people get? And I would say that tends to stop at we do quarterly access review. So it's a great idea. It's a great notion that we should be working towards least privilege. The least privilege is zero, right? So maybe we ought to think about, architectures that say, if you're not using it, you don't have anything, right? And that's it. And how we do it, the how is going to be super dependent. But I do think you can start today with it. And that's powerful.
No, I absolutely agree. We should start doing it today. Like, no doubt.
But and I think, Mike, you were talking about this a little bit beforehand, is there's maybe a little sleight of hand going on, right? Like, so good magician should actually explain the trick. What this does is it shifts risk out of the systems which could have the highest blast radius, right? These really critical systems. And it shifts that risk to the people that are editing policy, that have access to those authoritative policies, and the systems that govern them. And to me, that's a great place for centralization, because now I've actually can watch what's going on because this is my control point. These are my control points. But it doesn't magically make risk disappear. I don't want to have people come away from this and be like, oh, this will magically make me pass my audit. It's like, oh my gosh, no. But what it does do is it changes where higher audit and control requirements live now in these control points, these policy authoring points, these administration points, versus saying, I've got to worry about it both there and in my target systems.
Vlad, any last thoughts?
Well, first of all, it was an amazing conversation. Ian, as always, is a privilege to talk to you and kind of listen to you. And was everything. And Mike, I agree that this conversation, which we started, probably will be continuing for a while, and we can probably continue this in Identiverse and other things. But and finally, I would say, closer we get to the point when people will have privileges only at the time they need to use them, better we will be. Because that's where we're going. And I agree with Ian that dynamic. I'm getting very very excited about like dynamic privileges and all of that things. Thank you. It was great.
Ian, any last thoughts on zero standing privilege?
This has just been super fun to start thinking about and playing some of these sort of what if exercises at. How would it work here? What if we change this? What if we change that? I think that this is the beginning of the conversation. Like I am just sort of dipping a toe into it because I mean, I come from a privilege, the provisioning background. Like I'm very admin time. Everything's got to be done a priori. And it's like very uncomfortable to be like, oh no, it's cool, man. There's gonna be like an event and magical things gonna happen. Like I'm still trying to come to grips with this thing. And I'm super glad, Mike, that you gave us the opportunity to talk some of these things out, and there'll be more because by no means have we all figured this out whatsoever.
Is this a warm up for your live stream next week with Simon Moffat and Atul from Signal?
A little bit, but I'm honestly like dark secret. I don't actually prep super hard for like what I'm specifically going to say. I know the topics and I want to do it because it'll be super fun when it's got that energy of like, oh my gosh, I hadn't thought about that. Let's do that live on camera. So a little, but we'll see what happens next week.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot, Ian, for joining us.
Oh, thanks, Mike, for having me. Thanks, Vlad. Great to see you too.
Good to see you.
Thank you so much, Vlad, for making time today. I know it's always hard. Thank you guys for putting up
You're
with
welcome.
my learning process here of like, I'm still trying to figure out, as you see, how how this platform works. But I just want to
Okay.
say this was sponsored by Glue, Join a Gamma Lab. And these are my pigeons in the background flying out of my loft. So next week, we're going to do a deep dive with Cerbos. Amre Baran, one of the founders and CEO of Cerbos, will be online. And Brad Toomey is the guest, I think. Oh
Ooh.
man, I got to check. Either that or Toomey is the guest on the next one. But anyway, thanks a lot, guys, and we'll chat soon.